They were dead before the candles burned down. 13 voices silenced in one New Orleans mansion, their final screams clawing at the velvet wallpaper as if the walls themselves would remember. The record books whispered fever, but the physician's trembling hand scrawled another truth in the margins: blackened nails, purple tongues, and death that struck with mechanical precision, every victim collapsing exactly 90 minutes after supper. 13 gone. One remained. Violet, the cook, the slave who fed them, the woman no one was meant to talk about. Tell me where you're watching this from in the comments, because tonight, across time, across silence, across the polished lies of history, I'm going to pull you into Violet's kitchen, and once you step inside, you will not come out the same. Understand this: history has two versions, the one they print and the one they bury. What you are about to hear was never meant for you. It is dangerous knowledge, and if you choose to keep listening, you are already complicit. The Garden District of New Orleans in 1847 looked like a paradise in stone and ivy. White-columned mansions gleamed like marble temples to wealth, while inside, crystal chandeliers scattered candlelight like fractured stars. But wealth is always fed by something darker. Those gleaming floors were polished by broken backs. That laughter echoing in parlor rooms was purchased with blood, and in the kitchen of the Bogard mansion, beneath the perfume of roasted duck and spiced pralines, lived Violet, the hand that fed the family, the shadow who watched silently, the woman who would one day turn supper into massacre. Violet had been born into chains, her first breath drawn inside the slave quarters, her childhood consumed by fire and iron. Her mother, Essie, the head cook before her, had collapsed in exhaustion, stirring a pot too heavy for her failing body. Violet, just 14, took her mother's place at the stove. She never left it. Her food became famous: delicate sauces, golden roux, perfect breads. The elite of New Orleans praised the Bogards for their magnificent dinners, never knowing that the brilliance belonged to the woman they refused to name. But skill in that world was no shield. Violet's hands created masterpieces, but those same hands were forced to eat scraps in the shadows. She seasoned with intuition, smelled her way through dishes she was forbidden to taste, and her master, Octave Bogard, relished reminding her, "You will feed kings but die hungry." He ruled his plantation with cruelty, sharpened into an art. To polite society, he was a stern patriarch. To the enslaved, he was a viper, unpredictable, cold, sadistic. For years, Violet endured. She bent. She hid her feelings behind silence. But history tells us something chilling. When a soul is pressed beyond breaking, it doesn't always shatter. Sometimes it hardens, sometimes it sharpens, and that sharpening can carve destiny. The Bogards' weekly ritual was sacred: the Sunday supper, a theater of wealth, 7 courses laid beneath imported chandeliers, the family arrayed by rank, every smile rehearsed, every toast a performance. The enslaved moved like shadows around the table, unseen yet indispensable. Violet directed it all, her kitchen the beating heart of the ceremony. But a ritual is also a weakness, because rituals never change. Rituals make people predictable. Rituals create windows. Violet was watching, waiting, learning. In the summer of 1847, something shifted. Octave's debts grew heavier, his rage boiled quicker. He punished Violet in ways that were meant to break her body, her will, her spirit. But instead, he lit a fuse. And when the fuse burned down, it ignited the most forbidden act in the history of that house. Not an act of survival, not an accident, a deliberate decision, a reversal. That Sunday supper, the one no guest ever spoke of again, was her masterpiece. And tonight I will show you what she served. You must understand, New Orleans in 1847 was not just a city, it was a mask. On the surface there was music, opulence and laughter drifting from balconies strung with lanterns. Beneath there was rot. Every mansion stood like a temple to prosperity, but the foundation was slavery, unseen, unacknowledged, but everywhere, and the Bogard mansion was no different. Octave Bogard was a man obsessed with control. He inherited his fortune, his house, his land, and his slaves, but he carried none of the refinement that old Creole families pretended to cultivate. He was a man of appetite, money, flesh, power. His wife, Celeste, delicate and brittle, floated through the house like a ghost. She chose not to see the bruises, not to hear the screams, not to acknowledge the empire of suffering that fed her gowns and jewels. To maintain her standing in New Orleans society, she swallowed silence, like medicine. Their children learned quickly. Etienne, the eldest son, had already adopted his father's cruelty, practicing with words first, then with fists. Margot, 17, was clever, beautiful, and restless, playing at innocence while testing the edges of her power. Philippe, 15, drifted between arrogance and fear, already hardened into entitlement. And little Amélie, only 8 years old, watched and absorbed more than anyone realized. The house was never empty. Octave's younger brother, Auguste, and his wife Lucille lived there too, with their twin sons, Henri and Louis. Lucille busied herself with hosting salons, performing the role of cultured Creole lady, while her husband dealt in sugar and trade, always pushing, always scheming, and in the shadows of that family circle hovered the matriarch, Grand-Mère Bogard. Old, frail, yet still sharp-tongued, she believed the Bogards' bloodline was ordained to rule. Every decision, every cruelty, she justified with talk of legacy and destiny. This was the world Violet was born into, but unlike the others enslaved in the mansion, she stood at its center, silent, essential, always present. Her food held the family together. Her hands, blistered and scarred, were the invisible glue binding the Bogards' Sunday ritual. But imagine this existence, cooking feasts she would never taste, serving wine she would never drink, preparing desserts she would never touch. The cruelty was precise. It wasn't just about denying food. It was about stripping dignity, turning every act of creation into a reminder of ownership. And yet, Violet excelled. Her cooking was not just skill, it was language, it was memory. Her mother had whispered recipes into her ear like prayers, teaching her the alchemy of flavors, the sacred secrets of spice. Each dish carried more than sustenance, it carried will. The other enslaved whispered about Violet. Some admired her strength, some pitied her isolation. Old Moses, the butler, had served long enough to see lives broken and discarded, and in Violet's eyes he saw something dangerous, an ember that refused to die. Young Lily, serving as lady's maid to Celeste and the daughters, envied Violet's skill but feared her fate. And then there was Samuel, the stablemaster's son. His quiet strength drew Violet like a hidden flame. In stolen moments, away from the gaze of the house, they allowed themselves a dangerous luxury, tenderness. But in a world built on ownership, tenderness was rebellion, and rebellion had consequences. The Bogards' wealth was beginning to tremble. Floods had ruined the cane fields. Creditors whispered at doors. Octave's temper grew sharper, his punishments more creative, his paranoia heavier. He needed control. He demanded obedience, and he began to turn his rage more often toward the kitchen, toward Violet. The stage was set. The mansion appeared unchanged from the outside. Its balconies still draped in moss, its chandeliers still glowing. But inside something was cracking. The family's mask was slipping, and beneath that mask, Violet's silence was beginning to shift into something else. You've heard of monsters born in darkness, but sometimes the monster is not born. It is made, forged in cruelty, fed by humiliation, sharpened by grief, and Violet was sharpening. The summer of 1847 pressed down on New Orleans like a suffocating blanket. The air was so thick with humidity it clung to the skin like oil. The Bogard mansion shimmered under the heat, its white columns blazing in the sun, but inside the temperature was far colder. Tension ran through the halls like an invisible current. Octave Bogard's finances were unraveling. The sugar crop had failed, the creditors were circling, and the man who thrived on control was slipping. And when men like Octave lose control of their world, they don't admit weakness, they lash out, they make others bleed. That was the day Violet heard Samuel's cry. She was in the kitchen preparing canapes for a dinner party when it cut through the air, a sharp, guttural sound that froze her hands mid-motion. She ran to the window, heart pounding, and there in the courtyard she saw him, Samuel on his knees, shirt torn, back streaked red, and above him, Octave, whip in hand, spittle flying from his lips. "You dare look at my daughter with those eyes?" Octave's voice thundered through the courtyard. "You forget your place, boy." Violet's blood turned to ice. She had seen the danger forming. Margot, 17, had been lingering near the stables more often, her cheeks flushed whenever Samuel was close. Samuel, careful, distant, always pulled away, but on a plantation a slave's refusal could be twisted into presumption, and presumption was death. Samuel tried to speak, choking on blood. "Please, Master Bogard, I would never—" The whip cracked again, and Violet broke. She didn't think, she didn't calculate. She burst from the kitchen door, ran into the sun, and threw herself between the whip and Samuel's bleeding body. "Please, Master Octave," she cried, voice shaking but firm. "Samuel done nothing wrong. He's a good man. He works hard. He—" The words died in her throat. Octave's eyes fixed on her, not the eyes of a man caught in anger, but colder, calculating, a predator assessing prey. His expression shifted, and Violet knew she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The courtyard fell silent. The other enslaved shrank back into shadows, too afraid to breathe. Samuel's blood darkened the dust, and Octave stepped closer, whip lowering, voice dropping to a whisper more terrifying than his shouting. "So," he hissed, "the cook thinks she can tell me how to discipline my property." Violet's knees shook, but she did not move. "No, master. You just what?" He leaned in so close she could smell the brandy on his breath, see the broken veins in his face. "You think you can interfere? You think because you can cook a decent meal you have the right to question me?" Violet swallowed her fear. "Samuel is a good man," her voice steadied. "He ain't done nothing to deserve this." Octave laughed, a sharp, shattering sound. "A good man? He's property, my property, and so are you." His whisper cut like a blade. "And maybe you've forgotten that. Maybe you've gotten ideas above your station." That moment sealed everything. Octave ordered Samuel locked in the tack room with no food or water, until he learns respect. But Violet, oh, for her he saved something crueler. From now on, he declared, she would prepare meals as always, but she would not eat until the entire family declared themselves satisfied, and he made sure to remind everyone he was very difficult to satisfy. For 3 days she cooked, starving. For 3 days she carried heavy platters while her vision blurred. For 3 days she watched Octave take theatrical bites of her food, describing flavors she could not taste. Her body weakened, her lips cracked, her stomach twisted. But her eyes sharpened. Dr. Thibodeau, summoned to tend Samuel after another savage beating, noticed it. He too told his wife later. "That girl has the look of someone pushed past the breaking point. It's dangerous. I've seen it before." And he was right, because hunger and humiliation didn't break Violet. They forged her. In the fire of cruelty, she found clarity. She began to watch differently. Every gesture, every ritual, every weakness at that table. Octave believed he was teaching her submission. He was wrong. He was feeding her resolve. And in that kitchen, as the bread burned and the sauces boiled, something darker than hunger began to grow inside Violet. She was not just surviving anymore, she was planning. On the 3rd day of her punishment, Violet stood in the dining room as Octave raised a fork of her praline bread pudding to his lips. He chewed with exaggerated pleasure, his words dripping with venom disguised as praise. "Exquisite," he said loudly enough for the entire family to hear. "Sweet, soft, delicate, a masterpiece, and yet—" He placed the fork down. "Something's missing." He turned to her, eyes gleaming with cruelty. Perhaps because the cook hasn't eaten in days. Perhaps her senses are failing her. Laughter rippled around the table, forced, uneasy. Violet swayed on her feet. Her body was breaking, but inside something else had risen to take its place. Hunger had hollowed her out, yes, but into that hollow, something sharper had entered. A new clarity, a coldness, a focus. She began to notice things she had never seen before. Octave's right hand, trembling slightly when he was anxious. Celeste's darting eyes, always searching for escape from reality. Auguste's habit of drinking too much wine before speaking too freely. Grandma's shaking hands, but sharp tongue, always insisting the family's bloodline would endure forever. And she realized something that made her stomach turn, not with hunger, but with revelation. The Bogards thought themselves eternal. Their wealth, their power, their name, they believed it could not be broken. They believed the rituals of supper, the order of seating, the crystal and china, were proof of permanence. But Violet knew better. Rituals make people predictable. Predictability creates weakness, and weakness can be used. For the first time in her life, she began to see the dining table not as the stage where she was forced to serve, but as the battlefield where she could strike. In the shadows of the kitchen, she thought of her mother, Essie, who had died at that same stove, breaking her body to feed the family who owned Hachelin. She thought of Samuel, bleeding in the dirt for a crime he did not commit. She thought of her own empty stomach while Octave laughed at her suffering, and something inside her whispered, "Enough." That night, when the house slept, Violet sat alone in the kitchen with nothing but the dying coals of the stove for company. Her eyes burned in the half-light. On the table before her lay the tools of her trade, knives, jars of spices, bundles of dried herbs, ordinary things, everyday things. But in her mind, they transformed, no longer just the implements of cooking, but the weapons of a war. You must understand, Violet did not stumble into vengeance. It was not a moment of madness. It was not sudden. It was deliberate, cold, patient. Like a recipe, it required timing. Like a dish, it demanded the right ingredients. And the most dangerous ingredient was already at her disposal: trust. The Bogards trusted her hands. They trusted her food. They trusted her to perform the ritual of Sunday supper exactly as it had always been performed. That was their mistake. The next Sunday would not be like the others. Violet began to plan with precision. She thought of the courses, the order, the wines that would be poured, the way conversation would flow. She thought of the moment each fork would rise, each sip would be taken. And she imagined what it would feel like. 13 bodies collapsing one after another, the chandelier light glinting off crystal glasses as screams replaced laughter. This was not fantasy. This was preparation. Because once the decision is made, once the thought is planted, the act itself becomes inevitable. The Bogards did not know it, but their last supper had already begun. The night air in New Orleans carried secrets: the creak of ships in the harbor, the murmur of prayers in back-alley chapels, the whispered songs of the enslaved carried on the breeze like ghosts. But deeper still, beneath the polite facades of the garden district, there lived another layer of the city, a layer of healers, root workers, conjurers. Men and women who knew that the line between medicine and poison was nothing more than a matter of intention. Violet had listened. She had remembered. Her mother Essie had whispered warnings when she was a child. Don't touch the foxglove. It will stop a heart. Don't chew the oleander leaves. They burn the blood. Be careful with nightshade. One berry can blind a man. Essie had not spoken these things as threats, but as truths of survival. Knowledge that passed quietly among the enslaved, forbidden, but never forgotten. Now those whispers returned like a chorus, and Violet listened with new ears. The French market was her hunting ground. Every Friday she walked its stalls to buy food for the Bogards' Sunday feasts. Vendors knew her by sight. They praised her skill, handed her the best cuts, the freshest herbs. No one questioned the small bundles of roots she tucked discreetly into her basket, or the dried leaves she lingered over a moment too long. Why would they? She was the Bogards' cook. She was trusted. She was invisible. But Violet was not gathering food anymore. She was gathering weapons. Consider the brilliance of her plan. Poison leaves no knife marks, no screams in the night, no evidence but the silence it leaves behind. And in a city like New Orleans, where disease stalked the streets, where yellow fever and cholera struck without warning, death was easy to disguise. Dr. Tobido himself had said it. The Bogards' eventual collapse looked nothing like fever, but in the moment, who would question it? Who would sustain? Peck the cook? Violet studied her ingredients with the precision of a surgeon. A pinch of belladonna could make the tongue swell. A few seeds of castor bean could convulse the stomach. Powdered roots could blacken the nails, bruise the skin from within. Each substance alone was dangerous, but combined, they could create a symphony of suffering so exact it would look like fate. The kitchen became her theater. By day, she prepared soups, roasts, and pastries. By night, she tested. Not on humans, she dared not risk exposure, but on stray animals that roamed too close to the servants' quarters. She watched how quickly breath failed, how violently bodies rejected the poison, and she adjusted her measurements until she found a formula not of chance, but of certainty. This was not rage. Rage is messy, impulsive, dangerous. No, this was strategy. Violet was sculpting her vengeance as carefully as she seasoned a stew, each adjustment, each calculation a step closer to perfection. The enslaved around her sensed the change. Old Moses caught the fire in her eyes and said nothing. Young Lily, terrified, avoided her gaze. Samuel, weak but alive after his beatings, whispered her name like a prayer through cracked lips. But Violet's silence was complete. She carried her secret alone. And here is the truth that chills the bones. Violet was no longer cooking for survival. She was cooking for legacy. She was about to write her name into history with fire and venom. She was about to turn the Bogards' sacred Sunday ritual into a funeral banquet. The chandeliers would shine, the silver would gleam, the crystal would catch the light like stars, and every mouth at that table would open, trusting the food she placed before them. That trust was the blade she would drive deepest. The supper was coming, the ingredients were gathered, the recipe was ready, and when the family lifted their forks that Sunday evening, they would not be tasting food, they would be tasting Violet's revenge. Sunday came like it always did, draped in ritual and expectation. The Bogard mansion glowed with candlelight, its windows blazing like a temple to wealth against the dusk. Carriages rattled down the gravel drive, servants hurried to and fro, their movements rehearsed, their silence enforced. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Inside, the dining room was prepared with military precision. A starched linen cloth stretched across the long mahogany table. Crystal glasses stood waiting, catching the light of the chandelier like frozen fire. Silver gleamed beside each plate, polished until it reflected distorted faces. 13 places. 13 chairs. It looked like ceremony. It was ceremony, and Violet stood at the center of it all, directing her staff with calm authority. No tremor in her hands, no hesitation in her voice. She moved like a conductor at the edge of a symphony, every motion part of a larger design. But beneath the calm, her mind was fire. In the kitchen, the dishes waited, each one carefully prepared, each one laced with a secret invisible to the eye. The Bogards would taste luxury, but swallow ruin. She had balanced the doses with perfection, slow enough to mimic illness, fast enough to claim them before sunrise. The first course was carried in, turtle soup, a delicacy beloved by the family. The rich aroma filled the room. Octave Bogard raised his spoon with pomp, casting a smirk toward Violet, as if to remind her who held the power here. But Violet's face was unreadable. She bowed her head slightly, her mask flawless. Celeste, delicate and restless, sipped eagerly. August, ever the boisterous heir, demanded more sherry with his bowl. Grandmère sniffed, declaring it acceptable as always. And Violet moved silently among them, refilling, serving, her eyes sharp as glass. The ritual unfolded. The family spoke of debts, of suitors, of politics. Their voices rose and fell, ignorant of the shadow gathering around them. Each sip, each bite, was another step toward oblivion. The second course, roasted quail with pecan stuffing. Crisp, golden skin cracked beneath knives. Laughter rippled when August spilled wine across his sleeve. Octave scolded, then drank deeply, his hand trembling just slightly, a tremor Violet now watched with something like hunger. By the third course, the first signs appeared. Celeste dabbed her lips with a napkin, frowning. "The heat," she murmured. "It's stifling." Her cheeks were flushed, her breathing uneven. "Drink," Octave ordered, sliding his daughter's glass of wine closer. She obeyed. Violet's eyes tracked the glass as it tilted. Another step, another drop of poison swallowed. The fourth course, gumbo, rich with crab and sausage. Violet ladled it with grace, her movements slow, deliberate. As bowls emptied, silence began to creep around the edges of the table. A cough here, a wince there. Grandmère's spoon clattered against porcelain as her hand shook harder than usual. "Are you well, maman?" Octave asked, irritation sharpening his voice. I am," she muttered, though her lips had begun to darken at the edges. Violet's face betrayed nothing. She cleared the plates, her hand steady, but inside, her heart thundered with the rhythm of inevitability. This was the moment she had imagined 100 times, the moment when the line between servitude and power dissolved. By the fifth course, the laughter was gone. Celeste leaned pale against her chair. Auguste's boisterous voice cracked into silence, sweat running down his temples. Octave's jaw clenched as he forced another bite, determined not to show weakness, his pride greater than his body's resistance. And still, Violet moved among them, silent, watching, waiting. This was no supper. This was theatre, and she was both playwright and executioner. The chandelier burned overhead, candles dripping wax like the slow passage of time. 13 seats, 13 bodies, 13 destinies sealed. The poison had entered them. It was only a matter of time. And Violet, for the first time in her life, was not serving them food. She was serving them justice. At first it was subtle, a cough, a hand trembling on a wineglass, the faint scrape of a chair shifting against the floor, small, ordinary things that in any other moment would mean nothing. But Violet knew. She saw the way Celeste's face had gone pale as chalk, her lips tinged faintly blue. She saw Auguste reach for bread with clumsy fingers, dropping crumbs across the linen. She saw Grandmère's posture falter, her proud spine bowing under an invisible weight. And she saw Octave, always Octave, his jaw set, his eyes narrowed, his hand gripping the arm of his chair, as though sheer will could keep him upright. His pride was iron, but even iron rusts. The conversation at the table faltered, words broke apart into fragments, unfinished thoughts dissolving into uneasy silence. Only the clink of silverware remained, each sound louder than it should have been, echoing in the chandelier-lit chamber like a clock counting down. "Too warm in here," Celeste whispered, her voice distant. She dabbed at her forehead, her hand shaking. "You are hysterical," Octave snapped, though his own voice wavered. Then it came. Sudden. Sharp. Auguste lurched forward, his goblet toppling, red wine spreading across the white cloth like a wound. His hands clawed at his throat, gasping, choking. The room erupted in shouts, chairs scraping as the family surged to their feet. "What is happening?" Lucille cried, clutching her sons. "Get the doctor," Philippe shouted, though his words slurred, his legs buckling beneath him. Grandmère tried to rise but collapsed back into her chair, her silver hair falling loose as her hands trembled violently. The twins clutched each other, terror wide in their eyes as their mother pulled them close. The order of supper was gone, the ritual shattered, chaos spread like fire. And through it all, Violet moved with calm precision. She collected plates, she refilled glasses, her steps were measured, her expression unreadable. To anyone who looked at her, she was still the servant, still the silent shadow fulfilling her role. But inside she was blazing. For every scream she remembered a whipping, for every collapse she remembered a humiliation, for every choking gasp she remembered hunger gnawing her belly while she cooked feasts for others. This was not madness, this was balance. Octave staggered to his feet, his voice raw with fury. "What have you done?" he roared at Violet, his finger trembling as he pointed. The room froze, all eyes turned to her. And for the first time in her life, Violet did not bow her head. She met Octave's gaze with a calm so deep it was terrifying. She said nothing. Silence was her answer, and that silence was louder than any confession. Around them, the Bogards crumbled. Celeste slid bonelessly from her chair to the floor. Auguste convulsed, foam at his lips. Grandmère clutched her chest, gasping prayers to a god who would not answer. The twins wailed, their mother's sobs rising to meet them. It was a symphony of suffering, and Violet stood at its center, conducting with her silence. The chandelier burned above, its light indifferent. The table, once a shrine to wealth and tradition, had become an altar of death. The Last Supper of the Bogards had begun its final act. The dining room had become a tomb. The white linen, once spotless, was soaked with wine, bile and blood from bitten tongues. Silverware clattered to the floor, forgotten. Crystal goblets toppled, their contents pooling dark and sticky across the table. The chandelier's glow no longer looked elegant, it looked cruel, casting every contorted face in sharp, merciless relief. The Bogards were falling. Celeste writhed on the floor, her fingers clawing at her throat as though she could tear the poison free. Beside her, Lucille clutched her sons, their small bodies heaving with sobs as she gasped for air. Grandmère's prayers dissolved into wet gurgles, her rosary beads slipping through her spasming fingers, scattering across the parquet like fallen teeth. August had collapsed across his plate, his face in the quail, his breath shallow and ragged. Philippe had staggered halfway to the door before crumpling, his body twitching in the candlelight. And Octave alone remained standing. He gripped the back of his chair, his knuckles white, his breath tearing in and out of his lungs like a saw, his eyes, bloodshot and wild, locked onto Violet. Hatred poured from him, raw and blistering. "You," he rasped, his voice breaking into a cough. "You did this." Violet did not flinch. She did not speak. Her silence pressed down on him heavier than any denial could. "You think you've won?" Octave staggered a step toward her, spittle clinging to his lips. "You are nothing. A cook, a servant. You will die forgotten, while we endure." Violet tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. But inside, her blood burned cold. She saw what he could not. His body betraying him, his legs trembling, his chest heaving against the inevitability searing through his veins. He spoke of endurance, yet he was already crumbling. "You will choke on your own name before dawn," she whispered. At last, her first words of the night. It was not a shout, not a scream, but Octave froze as though she had struck him. Around him, the Bogards gasped, cried, convulsed. The great family of New Orleans, undone in their own dining room. Their wealth could not buy them breath. Their name could not shield them from death. Their rituals had become their execution. Octave lurched, reaching for her, but his body betrayed him at last. He collapsed, striking the floor with a sound that echoed through the chamber like the closing of a coffin lid. Silence followed, broken only by the shallow, failing breaths of the dying. Violet stood among the wreckage of the feast, her apron unstained, her hands steady. The house groaned around her, as though it too had witnessed the breaking of its masters. She was no longer just the cook, no longer the servant, the invisible shadow who bent under hunger and cruelty. She was the end. And in that moment, bathed in candlelight, surrounded by the bodies of her oppressors, she felt something vast stir within her, something older than vengeance, something greater than survival. The Bogards had believed themselves eternal, but Violet had become eternal instead. A story whispered in kitchens, in marketplaces, in the dark corners where the enslaved gathered. A story of poison, patience, and justice. The Last Supper of the Bogards would not be forgotten, and neither would Violet. The house was still. The cries, the gasps, the frantic prayers had withered into silence. Only the faint hiss of candles remained, their flames guttering in the stale air. The grand dining room, once a stage for wealth and ritual, was now a mausoleum, its table an altar of ruin. Violet stood at the head of it, her shadow stretched long against the wall. She did not tremble. She did not weep. The work was done. Around her, the Bogards lay scattered in grotesque repose. Celeste curled like a broken doll at her mother's feet. Lucille, her arms still wrapped around the twins, as though she could shield them from the poison that had already hollowed their breaths. Auguste slumped forward, his face buried in the feast he had once demanded. Grandmère, with her rosary tangled in stiffening fingers. Octave sprawled on the floor, his lips drawn back in a final frozen snarl. They had feasted, they had fallen, and they would never rise again. Violet untied her apron, folded it carefully, and laid it across the back of her chair. The gesture was deliberate, almost ceremonial. She was finished serving. Forever. In the kitchen, the fire had burned low, the pots cooling on their hooks. The tools of her labor gleamed faintly in the embers' glow. Knives, ladles, bowls, implements of survival, implements of war. She touched nothing, let them rest, as the Bogards now rested. She stepped through the servants' hall, past the rooms where the others slept fitfully, unaware of the storm that had broken. She paused by Samuel's door. Inside, she heard the shallow breath of a man not yet recovered from his last beating. She thought of waking him. She did not. His survival was gift enough. At the back door, Violet paused. The night air was cool, damp with river mist. The city stretched before her, vast and dark, the sounds of music and prayer and sorrow rising in the distance. Somewhere, a teamboat's whistle cut through the night. Somewhere, a woman sang to hush her child. Violet stepped into that night. She did not run. She did not hide. She walked as though the world belonged to her at last, and in a way it did, for the Bogards' house would soon fill with whispers, servants discovering bodies, neighbors crossing themselves at the news, doctors fumbling for explanations they could not give. Some would blame fever, some would mutter of curses, few would dare speak of poison. But in kitchens, in fields, in back alleys, the truth would spread, quietly, reverently. The cook did it. The woman with eyes like fire. She fed them their own deaths, and she walked away. Her name would pass in whispers from mouth to mouth, a secret prayer, a hidden blessing. Violet. Not a servant, not a victim, a reckoning. And though the city would never write her into its histories, the enslaved would carry her like a torch, a story to remind them. No house was untouchable, no name eternal, no chain unbreakable. The Bogards were gone. Violet remained, and the silence she left behind was louder than any hymn. Years passed. The Bogard mansion stood empty, its shutters drawn, its garden choked with weeds. People crossed themselves when they passed it, muttering that the house was cursed. Some swore they heard voices inside, the sound of laughter breaking into screams, the clink of silverware, the scrape of a chair pulled back from a table that no longer stood. Few lingered after dark. None entered willingly. The official story faded into polite evasions. Illness. A tragedy. Doctors spoke of fevers, of tainted meat, of mysterious afflictions. Priests called it the hand of God. The newspapers wrote a few short lines, then turned to other scandals. Wealth could not protect a family from death, but it could shield their memory from truth. And yet, truth endured. In kitchens where iron pots steamed and knives flashed, the servants whispered while they worked. Around fires in the quarters, the enslaved spoke softly so overseers would not hear. In markets and alleys, the name passed from mouth to mouth, never loudly, always with care. Violet. She had fed them, she had ended them, she had walked away. The story changed in the telling. In some versions, she slipped away across the river, vanishing into the swamps where no white man could follow. In others, she sailed north on a steamboat, disappearing into the free cities. Some swore she never left at all, that she still walked New Orleans, silent and watchful, her apron folded neatly over her arm. Children grew up on her story. For some, she was a warning, do not trust the hands that serve you. For others, she was a promise. Patience can be sharper than a blade. And with each telling, Violet became less a woman and more a force. A shadow stitched into the city's memory. A ghost who had sat at the table of her oppressors and made the feast their undoing. The Bogards' name rotted with their bones. Violet's name lived, and though history tried to erase her, the kitchens remembered, the quarters remembered, the whispers endured. Not servant, not victim, not forgotten. Violet. Justice served. New Orleans did not sleep the night the Bogards died. Word spread fast, though no one could say exactly who had carried it. By dawn, whispers slithered through the markets, the docks, the quarters, even the narrow alleys where washerwomen beat clothes against stone. The Bogards are dead. All of them? Poison, they say. No. Fever. A plague. Hush. It was her. But whenever someone asked who, the answer came only in murmurs, a name spoken carefully, like a prayer that might burn the tongue if said too loud. Violet. The masters spoke in clipped tones, furious and afraid. Some blamed bad meat, others a mysterious illness, and still others muttered about curses. Doctors argued, priests preached, lawyers drew up frantic papers to guard estates that no longer had heirs. The Bogard fortune, once untouchable, was suddenly a carcass for scavengers. Among the enslaved, it was different. They carried the story like a coal kept hidden in the hand, dangerous but warm. They spoke of Violet in kitchens while they kneaded bread, in the fields when overseers turned their backs, in the hush of night when fear pressed hardest. She fed them death like supper. She walked away, untouched. She was one of us. Some said she had fled upriver, vanishing into the swamps where no white man dared follow. Others swore she was seen boarding a steamboat bound north. A few whispered she had never left the city at all, that she walked its streets still, invisible as always, her silence sharper than any blade. But no one could say for certain. The mansion where the Bogards had feasted stood empty now, windows shuttered, doors locked. Yet children dared each other to creep close after dark, pressing their ears to the wood, swearing they heard the clatter of dishes and the choking of ghosts. The house had become a wound in the city, one that would not heal. And Violet had become me more than a woman. She was a story, a shadow stitched into every whispered warning, every quiet hope. She was gone, but she was everywhere. The weeks that followed were heavy with silence. In the quarters, the enslaved no longer whispered only of pain or hunger. They whispered of Violet. Her name became a secret thread stitched into hymns sung at night, into the rhythm of hammers striking nails, into the hum of lullabies mothers sang to restless children. She waited, she planned, and she struck. If she could do it, so can we. She was patient, and patience is a weapon. Her story carried more weight than sermons, more fire than the preacher's words. For the enslaved, Violet was not just a woman. She was proof. Proof that the mighty could fall. Proof that even the richest names in New Orleans could be choked silent at their own table. And the masters knew it. In drawing rooms and parlors, where lace curtains filtered the sun and cigars smoked in nervous hands, the white families spoke of the Bogards in low, tense voices. They said, illness. They said, God's will. But in their eyes lingered another truth. Fear. The kitchens troubled them most. Every spoonful of soup, every glass of wine, every bite of bread brought hesitation. Wealth could buy delicacies from Paris and wine from Bordeaux. But who prepared it? Who carried it to the table? Who stirred the pot when no one was looking? The servants' hands. For the first time, the masters tasted their own dependence, bitter and sharp. They could not live without the very people they thought beneath them, and they could not forget that Violet had reminded them so terribly that those same hands could serve death as easily as supper. The result was paranoia. Some households dismissed their cooks, preferring to eat bland food they prepared clumsily themselves. Others doubled their cruelty, beating servants on the smallest suspicion. But none could banish the shadow of Violet's name. For the enslaved, it was hope. For the masters, it was fear. And in that balance, Violet lived on. Her silence louder than any scream. Time reshaped her. The story of Violet no longer belonged to the truth alone. It belonged to the telling. In one quarter, they said she had slipped into the swamps, where she became one with the reeds and shadows, guiding runaways through the dark with eyes that glowed like coals. In another, they swore she had gone north, dressed as a free woman, her silence a disguise more powerful than any paper. Some claimed she haunted the Bogards' mansion still, her footsteps echoing down the dining hall, her apron folded neatly over her arm. Every retelling carried a piece of truth and a veil of invention. To children, she was a figure to hush fears. Sleep, or Violet will come for you with her silent hands. To the enslaved, she was a promise, patience, and even the great houses will fall. To the masters, she was a warning. Trust no one who serves your table. Songs rose in her name, though none dared sing them aloud when overseers stood near. In kitchens, women hummed her story under their breath while they chopped onions. In fields, men shaped her tale into rhythm as they swung their hoes, keeping time with whispers of her name. Violet had become what no chains could bind, a symbol. She was vengeance made flesh, hope given form, fear given voice. And in the space where truth ended and legend began, she grew larger, more powerful, less human, and more eternal. The Bogards' deaths had been the end of a family, but Violet's silence, that was the birth of a myth. New Orleans breathed differently after Violet. Markets bustled as always, but conversations paused whenever a servant passed too close. On balconies draped in iron lace, women sipped coffee with forced smiles, their eyes darting toward the kitchens. Men at gambling tables laughed louder than before, as though to drown their unease, but when their food arrived, their laughter faltered. The masters had begun to taste suspicion in every bite. Some locked their pantries, their wine cellars, even their sugar jars. Others forced enslaved women to taste each dish before they ate, watching closely for the twitch of a poisoned muscle. But even these precautions could not wash away the fear, for who could be trusted when Violet had shown them that obedience was only a mask? Meanwhile, in the quarters, her name burned like a secret flame. At night, around low fires, the people told her story in fragments, each adding their own thread. They spoke of her patience, her silence, her steady hands. They spoke of how she waited and how she struck. They spoke of the Bogards' fall as though it were scripture, and they carried her with them. A field hand, whipped bloody, raised his head again, whispering, "Violet." A mother torn from her child rocked herself to sleep, humming, "Violet." A boy, too young to understand hunger, clenched his fists when he heard her name, and for the first time believed the world could change. The masters called her a curse. The enslaved called her a promise. And in the shadows between them, Violet lived, unseen, unheard, untouchable. The city did not know whether she had died, fled, or still walked among them. But the truth no longer mattered. What mattered was this: Violet was everywhere, and she could never be silenced again. Years folded into years, and Violet became untouchable. The Bogards' mansion crumbled, its shutters sagging, its garden strangled by weeds. Ivy climbed its walls as if to bury the memory of those who once dined there, yet no vine could strangle the story. Children dared one another to touch the gate, then fled shrieking, swearing they had heard voices, the scrape of chairs, the choking of throats, the soft, deliberate step of a woman who never rushed. The house was empty, but the silence within it was alive. The city itself carried her now. On feast days, some masters hired white cooks, fearing their own kitchens. At auctions, bidders studied the faces of women and men with sharper suspicion, wondering which hand might hide a Violet. Fear had become part of the currency of slavery. But in the hidden places, in the hush of cabins, in the swamps where runaways crouched under moonlight in songs sung low and trembling, Violet was not fear. She was fire. Her name lived on the lips of those who dreamed of freedom. She was proof that chains could not hold the mind, that silence could be sharper than steel. She was not a woman anymore. She was a shadow that walked beside them, a memory that bent time, a whisper carried forward by every beating heart that refused to break. The Bogards were dust, forgotten. Violet was legend. Eternal,